We are looking at a version of moral relativism or ethical relativism called conventionalism, the idea that moral principles are relative to a culture. And we're in particular looking at Ruth Benedict's arguments in favor of conventionalism. And before we get into Benedict's particular arguments, I just want to talk about a broad motivation that some people have for conventionalism. And there's a writing by Herodotus, a historian, who talks about a king who brings together two groups of people to talk to them about how they treat the bodies of those who have passed away, that they want to show respect toward. How do they do that? And the Greeks were asked this question, and they said, well, we burn the deceased in our rituals. And Colossians who were present there were aghast. They were offended. They thought that was horrible. Well, what did the Colossians do? They ate the deceased in rituals, which to us, of course, sounds quite offensive, but each different culture had their own methods of dealing with this. And so this is kind of a motive. Different cultures have different methods of dealing with things, have different principles and different values, just a broad motivation. Let's go on and look at what Ruth Benedict herself had to say. Now, this is written in 1934. Dates in particular generally aren't that significant for philosophy, but sometimes the background culture is. And Benedict is actually an anthropologist by training, not a philosopher, even though she's providing some philosophical arguments. And anthropology in the 1930s, it was just fantastic, just a great time to be an anthropologist, because you had the technology of air travel to get to all kinds of different parts of the world. And yet there were these pockets and areas of the world that had never really had contact with contemporary society. And so you were able to go and study cultures as they were practiced for centuries. And so that's what Benedict did as an anthropologist. And she shared stories and learned from other people's stories of how different cultures interact. And her article is primarily a documentation of cultures that apparently have drastically different ethical values, moral values than we do. And so that's a basis for what she has to say about relativism. And through that, Benedict concludes that what's considered abnormal in one culture is perfectly normal in another. And of course, the converse is true. What's normal in one culture is often considered really abnormal and weird in another culture. So she provides a couple examples. One of them is a story about a man who wanted to share his yams. So this was a group of people where yams were their main sustenance, the main thing that they ate. If you didn't have enough yams over a season, you might starve to death. And in that culture, they were also focused on, obsessed with even poisoning. And so no one would share their yams. If it got to the time of the season where the harvest was in months in the past and yams were running low, you wouldn't eat anyone's yams because you were afraid that they might be poisoning you. In fact, instead of saying thank you for a gift that they received, their custom was to say instead, now remember, if you poison me, I won't be able to return the favor. In any case, there was a man within that culture who had an abundant crop of yams and tried to share his yams to people who were starving. And the other people in the village considered him dangerous. Watch out for that guy. He's going to try to share his yams. You know, don't trust him. So he was considered to be abnormal at the least and dangerous and attempting to harm people because he was trying to share his extra food. Of course, our culture would see that in an exact opposite way, We laud those who want to share their food, who give to charitable organizations, who provide food for those in need. Another example was a vengeful chief of Kwakiutl. In this case, I won't go through all the details, but the chief had a sister and niece who died in a apparent accident. There was no evidence of homicide, no evidence that anyone in particular caused their deaths, but he had this culture, the group of people had this culture where you just don't mourn. Mourning is a sign of weakness. So when he heard about the deaths of his sister and his niece, he went to a nearby village, killed a bunch of people, and then they returned, he and his men, and you could hear the mourning in the distance, and the chief said, "Ha, who are the weak ones? They are the ones mourning, not us." Now, to us, that's a horrible murder. To that group of people, it was just a sign of strength and what a good chief would do. So we have this really varied actions and judgments of actions according to different cultures. So an anthropological conclusion, I should have said, is that normality and abnormality are culturally defined. It's defined entirely by your culture. They're contingent. Some things that are considered normal could have been considered abnormal and the other way around. It just happened to turn out one way or another. And so that's going to be true of our modern Western cultural norms as well. They could have been quite different from what they in fact are. So we value sharing food. We think it's immoral to go kill innocent people, but we could have turned out in a very different way. Okay, so that's Benedict as an anthropologist. What does she do with this? How does this fit in with philosophy? Well, Benedict takes these stories and ideas and then makes some philosophical claims based on them. So she goes on to say that, well, the moral good is just another term or phrase for what is habitual and common. Whatever is habitual and common, we call that morally good. Whatever's abnormal, we call that morally bad. So this is a philosophical claim. Now, an unstated implication of this claim is that all moral principles and values then are going to be relative to the culture in which the behavior is considered. All of them are determined by culture. None are universal and apply to all cultures because cultures could turn out one way or another. And so that now is a more substantive philosophical claim about the nature of moral principles. And when you put those claims together, we have what we call conventionalism. On the positive side, we might say, is the idea that the moral principles are relative to a culture. That's where they get their validity from. And on the negative side, there are no moral principles that are going to be applicable, legitimate across all cultures. And that's just what the philosophical position of conventionalism is. Now, since Benedict is an anthropologist, she doesn't quite put this spelled out in an argument like a philosopher would do, but we can see from the text that she does have an argument. We might have to fill in some gaps, but it goes something like this. Look, first we do the observations. We find that there are significant differences in what's considered normal in differing cultures. And certainly she seems to have provided evidence for accepting that first premise. Now, Louis Poyman, in criticizing conventionalism, will call this the diversity thesis. There is a diversity of norms across various cultures. Then she goes on to argue that basic moral principles, what actually is morally right or wrong, right? And values, what really is morally good or morally bad, are solely determined by what is normal in a culture, right? We saw that on the previous slide. Now, Poyman calls this the dependency thesis. The idea is that moral principles, what's morally right or wrong, what's morally good or bad, fully depend on a culture. Now, you put those two together, you have this claim: whatever's morally right or wrong varies and is relative to a culture. Now, that's the positive thesis of conventionalism then. Now, if that's true, Benedict argues, right, if it's true that what's ever morally right or wrong or good or bad varies and is relative to a culture, then there are no objective moral principles or values. Then we get the negative claim. And so therefore we conclude there are no objective moral principles or values from 3 and 4. That's the negative thesis. And then we have together conventionalism is therefore correct. We have the positive thesis with number 3, a conclusion of that sub-argument, and we have the negative thesis in 5, and that's the conclusion of the sub-argument putting 3 and 4 together. So that's her argument. That's her basis of reasoning for claiming that conventionalism is correct. So now we are faced with a question: is she right? Now, we're not going to go on to criticize her argument here in particular, except to take one point. And what has been set up here is the bigger question then: are moral principles, and we're talking about all moral principles, are they more like principles of etiquette or principles of prudence? And so if they're like principles of etiquette, that means they're determined only by how people act and what people endorse, what people say is right. And so, for example, eating rice. In one culture, you eat rice with chopsticks. In another culture, you might use a fork. In another culture, you might use your fingers. And if somebody's going to ask, well, what's the right way to eat rice? There is no answer to that question except to say, well, it's right to use chopsticks in this culture, right? Or it's perfectly acceptable to use your fingers in this culture, right? That's the only way you can answer the question, is by identifying a culture in which it is accepted. And so what Benedict is saying is that moral principles are like that. Now, someone else like Louis Poyman does not agree. Poyman thinks that moral principles are more like principles of law or prudence, practical principles, how to get things done. Now, these are determined by a standard apart from what people believe. It doesn't matter what people believe, doesn't matter how they act. There are certain principles that are to your advantage if you act a certain way, and it doesn't matter what the culture thinks. So, for example, efficient travel. If somebody thinks or believes that if you're traveling from, say, Chicago to St. Louis, and somebody believes, well, first you got to get to Missouri, and what's the town that I know Missouri best? Well, that's Kansas City, Missouri. And so you go from Chicago to Kansas City. We're imagining driving a car. And then once you get to Kansas City, you just take I-70 across to St. Louis. Now, if somebody said that and believed that, if the whole culture believed that, it wouldn't matter, they would be wrong, right? That is not the most efficient way to get from Chicago to St. Louis. There's a much more direct route. And so it doesn't matter what people believe. It doesn't matter if a whole culture endorses a certain path. They still could all be wrong. There's a standard apart from what people believe and how people act. The same thing maybe for preparing for an exam. Suppose you're in a culture that says, you know, when you have a big exam, the most important thing to do is, say, identify your lucky hat. So you have to wear different hats at different times, and then you find out when do good things happen to you with which hat. And then once you find the hat that when good things happen, you wear that hat for the exam, and that's how you prepare for an exam. Obviously not my recommendation. Instead, right, it doesn't matter if a whole culture, if an entire fraternity or an entire university thought this and believed this and acted in that way, they would all be wrong, right? That is not the best way to prepare for an exam. So on the one hand, you have principles of etiquette entirely dependent on what people do, what people endorse. On the other hand, there are principles of prudence that it doesn't matter what people do, what they endorse, they can still be wrong. So are moral principles like principles of etiquette completely relative to the culture, or are moral principles like principles of prudence? They are just there, they apply irrelevant of what the people do and endorse in that culture. Now, here's just a little bit of criticism of our argument. We had premise 2, just to remind you quickly, was that basic moral principles, what is actually morally right or wrong, and moral values are solely determined by what's normal in a culture. Now, why would you think that? Right? Why would you think that this premise is true? Someone like Louis Poyman is an objectivist, would say that it's false. Now, here is a possible defense. I'm not saying that this is Benedict's reasoning. I'm not making that claim. I'm not even making the claim that this is the most common reasoning, but possibly, I have heard this, some people have said this, some people think that all non-physical matters, when we're talking about non-physical matters, like what's morally right or wrong, what is true is then determined by what is accepted as true. So if it's accepted as true, that just makes it true. And then that, of course, applies to moral principles. And so that's a motivation for the second premise. Now, again, I'm not saying this is Benedict's reasoning. To consider actual criticisms of conventionalism, we have other videos on objectivism. We have other videos on conventionalism that you can watch to see those criticisms. But the problem with taking the route that I just suggested is that the motive is false. It's certainly not the case that when we're talking about non-physical matters, what's true is determined by what people accept as true. It's certainly not the case in math. Those are non-physical matters. It's certainly not the case in logic. What are good logical principles and what are bad? It's not determined by what people accept. It's certainly not true about the afterlife. For example, the Heaven's Gate cult, they thought that by following their leader, that if they killed themselves at the proper time, they would be taken up into this spaceship in the afterlife and have a wonderful life, right? It doesn't matter if that entire group believed that, it doesn't make it true, right? And so there are truths in non-physical matters. It's not determined by what people believe and what people accept, right? What is believed, stated, what's practiced. They don't determine principles for all non-physical issues, right? They might for some, for like principles of etiquette, but not for all non-physical issues. So you can't have that global thesis as a defense for premise 2, right? Note again, just as a reminder, view the video on scientism for some review. Not everything that's true can be proven true by science or our senses. And I just gave some of those examples above here that are things that are true that can't be proven by science and that we can't explore by our senses. And so that's just a possible way to motivate that second premise that is clearly wrong-headed and mistaken. Again, for other criticisms of conventionalism, look at my videos on conventionalism and on objectivism, and the video on Poyman in particular on objectivism.